Lisa had always believed in kindness. She worked long hours at a small diner in Atlanta, serving food to people who barely noticed her. Every day, she wore the same faded apron, took orders with a polite smile, and cleaned tables while dreaming of a better life. The job wasn't easy, and the pay wasn't great, but she was grateful to have work. Even though Lisa struggled to pay her own bills, she never ignored those who had it worse. Every night, as she left the diner, she saw the same people huddled under streetlights or curled up on bus stop benches. It broke her heart to see them like that. One evening, just as she was about to lock up, she noticed a man sitting outside the diner's window. He wasn't asking for anything, just sitting there quietly, his hands tucked under his arms for warmth. His clothes were old and worn, his shoes barely holding together. His face was rough with an unshaven beard, and his eyes looked tired, as if life had been too heavy on him for too long. Lisa hesitated for a moment. The diner's manager, Mr. Grayson, didn't like it when employees interacted with homeless people. He believed it was bad for business. But Lisa couldn't just walk away. She had seen this man before, sitting in the same spot for weeks, never begging, never causing trouble. Making a quick decision, she stepped back inside, grabbed a plate of hot food, and walked toward him. "Hey," she said gently, kneeling beside him. "Are you hungry?" The man lifted his head slowly, his deep brown eyes filled with something Lisa couldn't quite describe. Pride, maybe, or sadness. He hesitated before nodding. I don't want to be a burden," he said in a quiet voice. "You're not," Lisa replied, placing the plate in front of him. "Everybody deserves a warm meal." The man stared at the food for a moment before finally picking up the fork. He took small bites, as if he wasn't used to eating regularly. Lisa sat down on the curb beside him, ignoring the cold. "You don't have to sit with me," he said after a while. Lisa shrugged. "I want to." They sat in silence as he ate. After a few minutes, he looked at her and said, "Thank you." Lisa smiled. "No problem." She wanted to ask him questions, where he was from, what had happened to him, but she didn't want to be rude. Instead, she simply stayed there, offering quiet company. When he finished eating, he carefully wiped his mouth with the napkin and set the plate aside. "That was the best meal I've had in a long time." Lisa felt a lump in her throat. "Come by any time. I'll make sure you get something warm." For the first time, the man smiled. Just a small, tired smile, but it was enough. And as Lisa stood up to leave, she had no idea that this small act of kindness was about to change her life forever. The next evening, as Lisa finished her shift, she found herself looking toward the spot where the man had been sitting the night before. To her relief, he was there again, sitting quietly with his hands tucked into his sleeves. His posture was the same, calm, distant, as if he was lost in his own thoughts. Lisa didn't hesitate this time. She went back inside, packed some food, and walked out to him. "Hey," she greeted, handing him the meal. "Figured you might be hungry." The man looked at her with those same deep brown eyes, filled with something she still couldn't quite understand. He hesitated for a moment before taking the food. "You didn't have to do this again," he said. "I know," Lisa said with a smile. "But I wanted to." This time, he didn't argue. He quietly unwrapped the sandwich and took a careful bite. Lisa sat beside him again, just like before, letting the silence settle between them. After a few minutes, she decided to break it. "I'm Lisa, by the way," she said, looking at him. He chewed thoughtfully before replying. "Nice to meet you, Lisa." She waited, hoping he would give his name, but he didn't. Instead, he kept eating, his eyes focused on the street ahead. Lisa didn't push. Maybe he wasn't ready to share. "You live around here?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but it faded quickly. "Something like that." Lisa noticed the way he spoke. His words were careful, his voice deep and calm. He didn't sound like most of the people she met on the streets. There was something about him, something different. You don't talk much, do you? She teased gently. He glanced at her, then shook his head. Not much to say. Lisa accepted that answer. She knew that people who had been through tough times often carried their stories deep inside, locked away. If he wanted to talk, he would. As he ate, a cold breeze passed through, and Lisa noticed him shiver slightly. His jacket was thin, barely enough for the chilly night air. Without thinking, she stood up. Wait here. Before he could ask why, she rushed back inside the diner, grabbed an old hoodie from the lost and found bin, and brought it out to him. Here. It's not much, but it'll keep you warm. The man stared at the hoodie for a long time before taking it. His fingers brushed over the fabric like it was something precious. When he looked up at Lisa, there was something new in his expression. Gratitude, but also something deeper. Thank you, he said softly. Lisa shrugged. It's just a hoodie. He shook his head. No, it's not. Lisa didn't know what he meant, but she didn't ask. She just smiled and sat beside him again, never realizing that this simple moment would change both of their lives forever. For the next few days, Lisa kept an eye out for the man. She had gotten used to seeing him in his usual spot outside the diner. Each night, she brought him food, and they sat together in comfortable silence. He still hadn't told her his name, but she didn't mind. One evening, as she handed him a warm meal, she decided to ask something that had been on her mind. You seem different from the others around here, she said carefully. I mean, the way you talk, the way you carry yourself. You don't seem like someone who's always been on the streets. The man looked at her for a long moment, then let out a soft chuckle. You're observant. Lisa smiled. I try. He took a slow bite of his food, chewing thoughtfully. I wasn't always like this, he admitted after a moment. Life has a way of changing things. Lisa waited, hoping he would say more. He didn't. You must have had an interesting life before, she said, trying to keep the conversation going. The man gave her a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe, he said, but the past doesn't matter much when you're living day by day. Lisa nodded, understanding. She had seen many people come and go in this city, each carrying their own untold stories. Some had lost their jobs, some had lost their families, and some had simply lost hope. Whatever had happened to this man, she knew it wasn't her place to force him to share. Instead, she decided to change the topic. Do you like music? She asked. The man's face lit up, just a little. Yeah, he said. Always have. Lisa grinned. What kind? Jazz, he answered almost immediately. Real jazz. The kind that tells a story without words. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Like Miles Davis. His eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe even respect. You know Miles Davis. Lisa laughed. Hey, just because I work in a diner doesn't mean I don't have good taste. For the first time, the man chuckled. A real, genuine laugh. It was deep and warm, and for a moment, he didn't seem like a man who had lost everything. He just seemed like someone who loved music. I used to play, he admitted after a pause. Lisa's eyes widened. Seriously, what instrument? Piano, he said, a hint of pride in his voice, and a little bit of sax. Lisa leaned forward, fascinated. That's amazing. Were you in a band or something? The man hesitated, then looked away. Something like that, he murmured. Lisa could tell he didn't want to say more, so she didn't push. But her curiosity grew. Who was he before he ended up here? And why did he sound like someone who had once lived a very different life? She didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out soon. Sooner than she ever expected. The next night, Lisa stepped out of the diner with a warm meal in hand, expecting to see the man sitting in his usual spot. But as she looked around, her heart sank. He wasn't there. She frowned, scanning the sidewalk, hoping maybe he had just moved to a different spot. But the place where he always sat was empty. The cold wind blew through the street, making her pull her jacket tighter around herself. Maybe he left early, she thought, Or maybe he had found somewhere better to stay. Still, something didn't feel right. He had been there every night for weeks, always in the same spot. It wasn't like him to just disappear without saying anything. Lisa sighed and sat on the curb, holding the warm meal in her hands. She didn't know why she felt so worried. It wasn't like they were close. She didn't even know his name, but there was something about him that made her care. He wasn't like the others. She waited for a few more minutes, hoping he would show up. But as the night grew colder, she knew she had to go home. With a heavy heart, she stood up and went back inside, leaving the untouched meal behind. The next day, she looked for him again. Still nothing. By the third day, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe he was sick. Maybe something had happened to him. The thought made her stomach twist. Finally, she decided to ask around. "Hey, Tony," she said to the cook in the kitchen. "You ever see that guy who sits outside? The one I always bring food to?" Tony wiped his hands on a towel and frowned. "The homeless guy? Yeah, I've seen him. He's been gone for a few days," Lisa said. "You hear anything?" Tony shook his head. No clue. Maybe he moved on. Lisa didn't want to believe that. He didn't seem like the kind of man who would just leave without a word. That evening, she walked down the street, searching for him. She checked the nearby alleyways, the benches, even the small park a few blocks away. But he was nowhere to be found. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a voice behind her. "Looking for someone." Lisa turned around and saw an older man sitting outside a convenience store. His clothes were ragged and his eyes were tired. "The guy who used to sit outside the diner," Lisa said quickly. "Have you seen him?" The man nodded slowly. "Yeah, saw some men talking to him a few nights ago. They didn't look too friendly." Lisa's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged. "Dunno. But they left together. Haven't seen him since." A chill ran down Lisa's spine. Who were those men? And where had they taken him? She had a feeling she was about to find out. Lisa couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. The thought of the man, her quiet, mysterious friend, being taken by strangers worried her. Who were they? And why had he gone with them? She wanted to believe he had left by choice, but something about it didn't sit right with her. He had always been careful, guarded. He never talked about his past, and now, after finally opening up just a little, he was gone. It didn't make sense. Determined to find out more, Lisa decided to ask around again. She walked back to the convenience store where she had spoken to the older man. He was still there, sipping from a cup of cheap coffee. "Excuse me," she said, stepping closer. "Those men you saw, what did they look like?" The man squinted, as if trying to remember. One of them was tall, real sharp-looking. The other one was built like a truck, bald head. They didn't look homeless, that's for sure. Lisa's stomach tightened. Did they force him to go with them? The man shook his head. Didn't look like it. But I could tell he wasn't happy. He just nodded and walked off with them. Lisa frowned. If he had gone willingly, did that mean he knew them? Or was he just scared? She needed more answers. She decided to check the shelter a few blocks away, a place where some of the city's homeless stayed when the nights got too cold. She had never seen him there before. He always kept to himself. But maybe someone had seen him recently. The shelter was a small, plain building with peeling paint and flickering lights. Inside, a woman at the front desk looked up as Lisa walked in. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for someone," Lisa said. "He's been missing for a few days. Tall, black, quiet, kind of keeps to himself. He used to sit outside my diner." The woman's expression softened. "I think I know who you mean. He never stayed here, but I've seen him around." Lisa leaned forward. "Have you seen him lately?" The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "A couple of days ago, some men came asking about him. They were well-dressed, not the kind of people who usually come around here." Lisa's pulse quickened. Did they say who they were? She shook her head. No, but they seemed important. Lisa's mind raced. Important? Well-dressed? Who were these people? And why were they looking for a man who had nothing? Something was going on, and Lisa was determined to find out what. She had a feeling that whoever this man really was, his past had just caught up with him. And somehow, she was now a part of it. Lisa couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his tired face, the way he had smiled when they talked about jazz, the way he had hesitated when she asked about his past. Now he was gone, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Who were those men? And why were they looking for him? The next morning, Lisa made a decision. She would find out who he really was. She went back to the diner, hoping that someone else had seen him before he disappeared. One of the regulars, a cab driver named Joe, often parked near the diner. If anyone had noticed something strange that night, it would be him. "Hey, Joe," Lisa said as she approached his taxi, which was parked by the curb. "Can I ask you something?" Joe, a burly man with a kind face, looked up from his newspaper. "Sure, kid. What's up?" Lisa hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know the guy who used to sit outside? The one I always gave food to?" Joe nodded. "Yeah, I saw him a few times. Quiet guy. Never caused trouble." Lisa leaned closer. "Did you see what happened to him a few nights ago? Some men took him away." Joe's forehead wrinkled as he thought. "Now that you mention it, yeah. I saw a fancy black car pull up that night. 2 guys got out, talked to him for a bit. Then he got in the car with them." Lisa's heart pounded. "What kind of car?" "Looked expensive," Joe said. "Couldn't see the license plate, but it wasn't some regular car. It was the kind rich people drive." Lisa's mind raced. Why would rich men be looking for a homeless man? None of this made sense. "Joe, do you think they forced him?" she asked. Joe shook his head. Didn't look like it. He wasn't happy about it, but he got in on his own. Lisa sighed. If he had left willingly, did that mean he had a past she didn't know about? Just then, something clicked in her mind. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he talked about jazz with such passion. And now, men in expensive suits taking him away. Could he have been someone important before? Lisa thanked Joe and hurried inside the diner. She grabbed her phone and searched for missing persons reports, famous musicians who had disappeared, anything that might give her a clue. After scrolling for a while, she froze. A news article from years ago caught her attention. A well-known jazz pianist had vanished from the public eye after a personal tragedy. He had lost everything: his career, his family, his fortune, his name. Lisa's hands shook as she realized the truth. She had been feeding and talking to a man who was once one of the greatest musicians in the country. And now he was gone. Lisa stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The article showed a picture of the man she had been helping, except in this photo, he wasn't wearing ragged clothes. He was dressed in a fine suit, sitting at a grand piano, his fingers gracefully touching the keys. His name was James Carter, once a legendary jazz pianist known around the world. The article explained how he had disappeared years ago after suffering a great loss. His wife and son had been in a car accident while he was away on tour. After their passing, James had fallen into depression, leaving the music world behind. No one knew where he had gone, until now. Lisa covered her mouth in shock. The quiet man she had been feeding, the man who had spoken about jazz with such deep passion, was once a famous musician. But now he was living on the streets, forgotten by the world. She suddenly felt sick. How had no one recognized him? How had he ended up like this? Lisa knew she couldn't just sit back anymore. She had to find him. The only clue she had was the black car that took him away. If the men weren't forcing him, then maybe they were people from his past. But were they trying to help him or take advantage of him? She decided to search for more news about James Carter. Maybe someone had started looking for him after all these years. She scrolled through different articles, and finally found something that made her heart race. A wealthy music producer named Michael Hayes had recently announced that he was searching for James. According to the article, Michael was a close friend of James back when he was famous. He had been trying to find him for years, wanting to bring him back into the music world. Lisa read further and found a shocking detail. Michael had hired private investigators to track James down. The description of the men matched what the old man at the convenience store had told her. So they weren't kidnappers. They were people from James's past. Lisa's mind raced. Was this a good thing? Would James be okay? She had no way of knowing where they had taken him. Then an idea struck her. Michael Hayes was a public figure. If he had been looking for James, then maybe he would post something now that they had found him. Lisa quickly searched for Michael's social media accounts. And there it was. A new post, just a few hours old. A picture of James, cleaned up, wearing fresh clothes. The caption read, "After years of searching, I finally found my brother. The world will hear his music again." Lisa let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. James was safe. But the question remained, did he want to return to his old life? Or was he happier living in the quiet shadows? Lisa stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The article showed a picture of the man she had been helping, except in this photo, he wasn't wearing ragged clothes. He was dressed in a fine suit, sitting at a grand piano, his fingers gracefully touching the keys. His name was James Carter, once a legendary jazz pianist known around the world. The article explained how he had disappeared years ago after suffering a great loss. His wife and son had been in a car accident while he was away on tour. After their passing, James had fallen into depression, leaving the music world behind. No one knew where he had gone, until now. Lisa covered her mouth in shock. The quiet man she had been feeding, the man who had spoken about jazz with such deep passion, was once a famous musician. But now he was living on the streets, forgotten by the world. She suddenly felt sick. How had no one recognized him? How had he ended up like this? Lisa knew she couldn't just sit back anymore. She had to find him. The only clue she had was the black car that took him away. If the men weren't forcing him, then maybe they were people from his past. But were they trying to help him or take advantage of him? She decided to search for more news about James Carter. Maybe someone had started looking for him after all these years. She scrolled through different articles and finally found something that made her heart race. A wealthy music producer named Michael Hayes had recently announced that he was searching for James. According to the article, Michael was a close friend of James back when he was famous. He had been trying to find him for years, wanting to bring him back into the music world. Lisa read further and found a shocking detail. Michael had hired private investigators to track James down. The description of the men matched what the old man at the convenience store had told her. So they weren't kidnappers. They were people from James's past. Lisa's mind raced. Was this a good thing? Would James be okay? She had no way of knowing where they had taken him. Then an idea struck her. Michael Hayes was a public figure. If he had been looking for James, then maybe he would post something now that they had found him. Lisa quickly searched for Michael's social media accounts. And there it was. A new post, just a few hours old. A picture of James, cleaned up, wearing fresh clothes. The caption read, "After years of searching, I finally found my brother. The world will hear his music again." Lisa let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. James was safe. But the question remained, did he want to return to his old life? Or was he happier living in the quiet shadows?